Yes.
Okay. I remember my first time opening up a computer and seeing all these circuits and wires and parts, and I'm just like, man, that's complicated. But it was very interesting. So as I got older, I took classes and started studying on this and learning what the parts do. And that's why I'm here today, because I feel like you guys might not know what each part does or what each part is. And today I'm going to explain to you the three main parts in a computer and their purpose. Now I'm going to start with the motherboard. In the book, A Guide to Hardware Managing, Maintaining, and Troubleshooting by John Andrew, the definition is, the motherboard, also called the main board or the system board, or the techie jargon term, the MOBO, is the largest and most important circuit board in the computer. The motherboard also contains a socket to hold the processor or CPU. Now, in other words, I would say it's pretty much like the body. Without the body, you can't put any parts together. So, the reason why I did start with the motherboard is because of the form factor. Now, form factor determines the size of the board and its features that makes it compatible with the power supply and case. So now, without a form factor, there will be production of motherboards, and it would be like meant for this PC or this case or this part. So they had to come up with something to where one motherboard can work with all the parts. And I'm going to share three form factors with you guys today. One of the form factors is the ATX. So the ATX is the most popular. It's also the largest. It's 12 inches by 9.6 inches. The micro ATX, which is smaller. It's the same thing but smaller. It's meant for more of like laptops or like tablets. It's about 9.6 inches by 9.6. And then we have the mini ITX. The mini ITX isn't used as like that much, but it's meant for low-end computers, and it's also about the same size as the micro ATX. Now I'm going to share with you guys the sockets. So with sockets, the LGA 1150 and the LGA 1155, they're pretty similar, but the reason why I am telling you the main two sockets is because all the other sockets are outdated and no one ever uses them anymore. The LGA 1150 is the recent one, whereas the LGA 1155 is the third generation one. In each socket, what makes it different is the middle of it. So with this one, the more recent one, it has more cores in it. So when you use a stronger 9th gen i7 processor, it will be able to run it a lot smoother than if you were to use the LGA 1155. Now moving on to the power supply. Oh, forgot to say that. The FM2 Plus is a socket for the AMD processors. Whereas I forgot to mention the LGA 1155 and LGA 1150 are for Intel. The FM2 Plus is meant for AMD. It's the recent one. They don't really produce as much processors as an Intel, so they only have one socket that's up to date. So now I'm going to explain to you guys the power supply. So a computer power supply, also known as a power supply unit, or PSU, is a box installed in a corner of the computer case that receives and converts the house current so that the components inside that case can use it. In other words, to make it short, it's pretty much the power of the computer. Without it, you wouldn't be able to start your computer. So I have a picture of the power supply here, and I'm going to explain to you what each connector is. So we've got the main one, which is the P1 24-pin connector. That is meant to go into the motherboard. It's the main power for the motherboard. Whereas you have this 6-pin aux, which is meant for a little boost for the motherboard, but not too much. It's about 12 volts. And then you have the SATA cables, which are meant for the memory and the hard drives. And then you have the 4-pin Molexes, which are meant to boost the memory for a hard drive, but it's only about 5 volts, so it's not as much. And then you have the the 4-pin aux. So the 4-pin aux is basically similar to the 6-pin aux, but it produces lower voltage. So next is the processors. So a processor is the central processing unit, CPU, also called the processor or microprocessor, and does most of the processing of data instruction to the entire system. For short, it's the brain. Basically, what it does is it tells what each part needs to do to get the task done. Different types of processors, we have i7s, i5s for Intel, i3s for Intel, and then you have, for AMD, you have the AMD FFX. The main thing about processors is not too picturey, but basically you have 4 features. You have the speed, which is measured by gigahertz, and for most processors it's 1.8 to 4.4 gigahertz. Then you have the socket and chipset, which I explained earlier about each socket being different. And then you have architecture, which is the 64-bit and 32-bit. That's basically, the 64-bit is basically the most used. You rarely see a 32-bit, but the difference between them is one can handle more tasks at once and the other can handle less. Then you have multi-processing abilities. So what multiprocessing is when 2 processing units installed with a single processor. So a processing unit can handle 2 cores. So if you get like an i7 8-core, then you have 4 processing units. The different types you have is multi-threading, which is basically when a Windows sends a task, it sends a thread to the processor and then is distributed to the part to get the task done. A processor with more than 1 thread will need to require an extra register. You also have dual processing, which is different. It's like multi-core processing, except for one motherboard has 2 sockets, and you're able to put in 2 processors at once for that computer. To sum up, the 3 main parts of a computer are the motherboard, power supply, process, and processor, because without these parts, a computer would not be able to start up. Thank you. My bad.
So Javier, what did you think? Not here.
Not even the written evaluation.
Okay. Well, hang on just a second then.
Did you even
Michael, there's some things about the speech that I think are pretty effective, but there are also some things that are really problematic. So let's start with the effective stuff. I thought you had a nice attention device at the beginning, telling your personal story and knowledge of this subject. You have a pretty good organizational structure that you set up in the preview of the speech, and during the presentation, I thought some of the visuals were nicely explained. You try to integrate them into the presentation and show them at the right time. So I think you're making an effort to make it work for you. Some of the things though that are problematic: ATX, LGA, FM2 plus CPU 17, i7, i5, AMD, FFX, GHE, 2432, 2 core, 17 core. Holy criminy, we're getting way too much technical detail that you don't have time to explain. So we got a whole list of all of these terms, some of which you try to explain effectively, but most of which are just, they're going to go over our heads
Yeah.
in the short amount of time that you have. So you know, it's not that your audience is stupid, but let's face it, you only have 7 minutes that you're talking. And, you know, like I said, I counted at least a dozen tech terms that are all numbers, letters being combined here that nobody's going to remember unless they already have some background on this in this particular field. So I think you had the right idea. Let's stick to talking about the processor, the motherboard, and the power source. Those are your three.
I just felt like if I cut out most of this stuff, my presentation would be
Well, what you need to do is you need to skip all the technical stuff and explain what it does. You know, give us some examples about how these things work instead of trying to describe the difference between them, or like when people talk about dual core processing. Okay, what does that mean? Explain what dual core processing is. You don't need to tell us the names of the processors or their technical terminology. I don't think that is necessary. But what does it do? What is it allowing the computer to do?
Focus more on this instead of like the parts.
Yeah,
I think I was focusing on the parts.
Yeah, and I think that's the big issue is that you get kind of caught up in the minutia instead of the bigger picture. The bigger picture is the thing that would work in talking to this audience. The micro stuff, and by the way, I know there's a micro term in your visuals also. That's not the one I'm talking about. You know, all of the little things there are going to they're going to get lost. Nobody's going to remember all those things unless they were taking extensive notes or unless they had some previous history with those things. So, you know, that's, I think, the main issue here is that you get kind of caught up in this, all these little bits and pieces of information instead of sticking to the bigger picture which is what do these three main components do and how do they allow things to work in your computer? You know, and when they interface with other elements of your computer, for example, most users they're interfacing with it in a operating system or through a browser when they're online. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how those things make that work instead of, you know, what the different varieties are and how they have these different, the number of pins that each wire has. It's useful if I'm a tech and I'm putting stuff together or taking things apart, but you couldn't teach somebody that in 6.5 minutes or 7 minutes. All right? All right. Thank you.